Hey guys, welcome back to Costumes TV. So today we're going to do something a little different. We did one of these videos last year. I'll throw it up here so you guys take a look. It's a tank's perspective. Basically, I go over the raid. I talk about the bosses, what they felt like, and then I rank them and put them into a tier list, how I felt the bosses were. And this is specifically around just from a tanking point of view. Now, I did most of these bosses on my Death Knight and my Brewmaster. Silken Court and Queen were only done on my Brewmaster, and I'm going to do things a little differently this time. Last time I spent a lot of time talking about each boss. What do the mechanics do? What about the positioning? What about the tank busters? And I kind of explained everything throughout the video. This time I'm going to do it a little different. We're either just hitting the record button and we're talking about the fights. I'm not going to go into full details about what the bosses were. I will explain the mythic mechanic since it does change, but I'm going to assume that most people have done normal or heroic, so I'm not going to jump into that. If you want to see each of the boss videos, there will be a playlist in the description down below, so you can take a look at each boss, and then you can skip to each chapter to see exactly what I ranked it at in my tier list, and at the end I'll give you the full tier list so you can take a look at it. What we're going to do is we're going to jump right in and we're just going to talk about the boss, what I liked, what I didn't like, the heroic and mythic versions, and then we'll go from there. So starting off with the very first boss of the raid, we have Ulgrax, the Devourer. For a first boss, I think Blizzard did really well with kind of upping the difficulty level. If you think of some of the previous bosses in the raid tiers, they were very simple, one or two mechanics, not a lot going on. This really was no different, but the damage was much higher. So early on in the season, it actually was a more challenging fight. It took a little bit more coordination. You couldn't miss some of the pulls. You had to clear out the webs, and the tank busters really did hurt. Originally, this fight was a 9-minute fight, and I believe on our kill, that's how long it took. The major change to Ulgrax was just the mythic mechanic, and that was the pull. You had to split the raid up, so 10 people would be in the soak to get the pull and get pulled towards the boss. If you missed it, the pull was actually very powerful. So if you missed one person, people would get sucked in right into the boss. So the tanks were also required to go into it, which is nice because that means you got some participation as a tank. You didn't just sit there and tunnel the boss the whole time. So it was a welcome change from the heroic one where you just kind of sit there and hit the boss the entire time and ignore every single mechanic. Especially later in the tier, nothing really mattered except for the pulls on mythic. There is a pretty neat intermission phase. The one thing I liked about this and that they carried over from beta is the telegraphing of the boss going out of the portal into the other side of the room. You can see the little swirlies flying through. I think they did a fantastic job. I really liked it. The ads during the intermission phase weren't too bad. Our group eventually had a double DK comp, so it's very easy for us to group all the ads together using sloppy hands. And then we also understood the trick later on where you can actually get the boss to spawn closest to you as long as you stood as a certain part of the room. So we would just kind of stand there, let the ads all come to us, and the boss would spawn next to us with all of the carcasses that he needed to eat. So it was really easy to get him out of that phase, and then we kind of just circle back into it and you just repeat the whole fight. I think, like I said, overall I think Blizzard did a fantastic job amping up the damage and healing output required for this boss, especially early on in the tier when you're walking into it for the first time with maybe, you know, your 2-piece and some mythic pieces from your vault. So I really did like how this fight played out early on. Eventually by the end of the season, we would just nuke it. Our challenge was to kill the boss before the first intermission phase, and most of the time we were successful. So that was kind of fun later on when you just start plowing through it. So for a first boss, I enjoyed it specifically as a Blood Death Knight. I would run around and actually clear some of the webs. You get to be a part of the pull and the mythic mechanic, and then you have the ad intermission where you were collecting the ads and just doing a ton of AoE damage. So for me, I think Blizzard did a great job with the first boss, and I'll actually put it into an A, keeping in mind that these rankings are not going to be based off of like, hey, you know, the last boss is S because it's the last boss fight and the first boss is D because it's a first boss fight. This is more so we're going to consider their placement and ensure they are ranked accordingly. So for me, Ulgrax lands in the A tier. Moving on to the second boss of the raid, Bloodbound Horror. Besides our guild always struggling with our left and right sides, or our blue and orange side, this boss was actually fairly well designed, I think, for a second boss, and at the same time it was a little frustrating early on trying to understand the beam mechanic. In Mythic, you get 3 of the ads during the intermission when you get pulled down. The challenge is they spawn exactly across from each other, so as the off tank who doesn't get pulled down, you have to think on the fly and see, okay, is the group that is down currently killing the ads they are on fast enough so that I can place the beam close to them? If they're not, I have to turn the beam a bit further so that way they don't get killed by it as it comes around and they have enough time to actually kill the ads. If I place it too close, they don't kill their ads they're at. If I place it too far, they can't get to the far ad. So early on in the season, it was actually a little frustrating because sometimes you would place it too far and they couldn't kill the second ad, so you would cause a wipe, or you'd place it too close and they couldn't kill it. Anyway, that is kind of what made it a little more interesting. The other Mythic mechanic is everyone gets targeted with the AoE circle and you have to spread, so that part wasn't too challenging. The biggest thing was just learning as a tank where to actually line up the beam and to get it right. I can see how in Heroic even this may be frustrating for pug tanks, that maybe there's no communication and they don't understand what they're doing and they just plop the beam right on the ads and suddenly a few people die. We did have scenarios where people wanted to stay close to the beam to kill the ads, and eventually they'd either get hit because there's some weird delay from when the boss spawns the beam to when it starts turning, and then just going down in their mission, you want to kick the Watcher ad and kill the Harbingers that spawn the ads. If the ads get to the boss, they pulse a massive amount of AoE. Now in Mythic early on, sometimes there is a chance that you would actually have one of the small little blood horror ads actually get to the boss and tick for a lot of AoE damage. So for healers, it was kind of fun early because you got the parse. Eventually, as the season progressed, you would be doing a lot more damage and the fight became trivial. Even on Mythic, we were able to really push through this boss so fast that we would maybe see one down phase for each tank and then the boss would fall over. So overall, there weren't really a lot of mechanics in this fight. It was basically one extra ad and make sure you can think on the fly with as the tank to ensure you place your beam correctly. It wasn't an overly engaging fight, but at the end of the day, I mean, for a second boss, I think Blizzard did good, especially going from Ulgrax to Bloodbound Horror. I think they did a fantastic job. It took our guild about 10 pulls to kill the boss, so it wasn't extremely challenging, which is good, right? So the ramp from difficulty didn't really increase. It actually decreased going into Bloodbound Horror. Taking a look at ranking the boss, so since it is the second boss and it did really feel like the difficulty dropped a little bit from the first boss, as a tank it wasn't really that engaging. I'm not a huge fan of bosses that just sit in the middle of the room and you go around in a circle. There isn't a lot you can do with that. Blizzard did do a good job kind of making it work, but for me it was okay. So I'm gonna rank Bloodbound Horror in the B tier. It wasn't the worst boss I've ever done, but it also wasn't that like exciting of a boss either. It's one of those let's get this over with and move on to some of the later bosses in the raid. So I rank it in B tier. All right, and next we take a look at the third boss of the raid, Sikran. I really like this fight. I really enjoyed it in beta and they came through on live. It wasn't an overly challenging fight for tanks. The biggest thing is the tank buster, 2 phase lunges and an expunge, and you always taunt on the expunge. However, in Mythic, the cool thing was there was some positioning changes as you had to move the boss over for the decimate cast, because if you lined him up on the edge of the room, it was much easier to have the decimates go straight through the clones that you place down in the room. The other thing to keep in mind, now it's 2 sets of clones per decimate, so you go up to 6 to 8 stacks of the dot when you explode them. So for healers, it looked like it was a lot of fight, and I was playing my Death Knight at the time, so I could push up those healing numbers significantly as I just kind of death strike through the dot. Early on in the tier, because you couldn't just sit down and nuke this boss like we did later in the tier, this ended up being about a 6.5 minute fight, and I think the pace of the fight, everything that's going on, was very well done by Blizzard. So even when the boss is about to perform a charge, there is a rain of arrows that is falling on the ground. You can see the rain of arrows and you just keep moving around the room. Every time you pop the decimates, the room fills up more and more and more. And the cool thing was with us, by the end of the fight, we really had a slither of the room left where we, as the tank, you could really play around with it. Like for example, as a Death Knight, I could AMS pull the boss into the purple puddles on the room for the shattering sweep casts. Early in the season, this was a really fun boss to prog because it wasn't overly challenging. There wasn't too much going on, but the pacing just kept kept you moving and moving. And I really do think that throughout Nerub'ar Palace, Blizzard did a fantastic job of pacing these bosses well. So it doesn't feel like there's too much going on, but it also doesn't feel like there's nothing going on. And Sikran was that real first introduction of like, hey, here's a lot happening, but it's fun. You have to position the boss. You have to watch out for the tank buster that's occurring. Make sure you don't miss the taunt. It is a guaranteed death on Mythic if you miss the expunge and a single tank takes both phase lunges and the expunge, which has happened. And then you have to dodge the rain of arrows, blow up the decimates. The room keeps filling up. Really, really, really a fun paced boss, even as a tank. Having done this fight in Heroic now also later in the tier and doing it early in the tier, the Mythic fight was definitely a lot more fun because there was actual concern with getting hit by the mechanics, getting hit by the rain of arrows, missing decimates, the dot. Definitely a lot more to worry about. When it came to the Heroic version, especially later on in the tier, you really could almost ignore some of the mechanics, pop more clones than you needed to. The other thing I didn't mention about Mythic is that when you have the clones come out during the charge, they have to be a certain radius away from each other, so having to place them in a proper box makes it easier to cast decimate on them. And again, these are just things that made these fights so much fun, in my opinion, even as a tank. So, and taking a look, even at our kill, we had most of the raid dead, and this boss only took us about 13 pulls to get. Later, we cleaned it up, but early on in the season, this was a fun boss to see. Everyone's fallen over, but you still have a chance. You can still get through it, and that's exactly what we did. So, for me, a very exciting and fun fight. I would place Sikran definitely in the S tier because it is the first fight you come across that is very well paced, very well telegraphed, requires coordination from the raid, and requires the tanks to pay attention to the tank buster and positioning when it matters most. All right, let's talk about the fourth boss in the raid. This boss to me is kind of whatever. It's Rasha'nan, the last boss of Dawnbreaker. You get him down to 60% in Dawnbreaker and you finish him off in Nerub'ar Palace. I guess overall the boss was fine. I think there's more happening for the rest of the raid than there is for the tank. For us, it really is just stand there, mitigate the Savage Assault, taunt after every second Savage Assault, follow boss to next platform, be in soak, rinse and repeat. From what I saw when you're playing a DPS or a healer, you have to pay attention to the web circles that come out because you have to move them off to the sides, and you have to move them to specific sides because you run out of room in the arena very quickly if you place them all too close to the boss. And then the healing check was definitely pretty high. I believe on our first kill, we actually 5 healed it. So early on in the season, having bosses that do require 5 healers was really neat to see and a welcome change because most bosses you could 4 heal, especially later in the season. I mean, we're 3 healing bosses at this point at the end of the season. So in my opinion, I think Blizzard did a fantastic job of tuning this boss. This is, to me, more of a healer type of boss. I think healers may enjoy this a little more because there's definitely more they have to pay attention to. There's some good spot healing that needs to occur. There's good AoE healing that needs to occur. And then for the tanks, it's really, as long as we're mitigating and not getting 2 stacks of Savage Assault, we're kind of fine. As a Death Knight, even if I took 2 stacks of Savage Assault, I could Death Strike through it, as for an external, and survive. It did happen quite a bit early on, so that was the one thing, kind of learning that taunt mechanic, because you have to taunt midway through the cast. If you taunt on the back half of Savage Assault, the current tank will get 2 stacks. So that took some getting used to. We did cause a few wipes like that, but eventually once we got it, we got through this boss fairly easily. As a tank, like I said, for me, it was very boring. Yeah, we got ads that come out, then we have some AoE we have to dodge, then we chase the boss. So kind of a boring fight from a tank's perspective. Very little to have to worry about, but I do think it was better for the DPS and the healers in the raid, which, I mean, sometimes you're going to have that as a tank, and that's perfectly all right. So not my favorite boss in the raid, but this was the boss that once you finished this, you can then move on and kind of pick which of the 2 bosses you wanted to go to. So that does kind of open it up after this point. Again, not a very high pull count boss. It took us 17 pulls to down this boss as well. And then I do think like the heroic version of the fight is even more boring and less interactive for tanks. You could most likely solo this boss in heroic at this point. Even early on, you could kind of solo it because you only get 1 Savage Assault strike. So you just kind of sit there, wait for it to drop, and continue on. So you could solo this fight in heroic, especially on a Blood Death Knight, because you could just heal yourself through almost every hit. Taking a look at what I would rank this boss, like I said, from a tank's perspective, the only thing you have to worry about was Savage Assault. So for me, Rasha'nan kind of falls in the D tier if you're a tank looking for something engaging. All right, and next up, we are going to talk about the Gahoon lookalike, the slug of a boss, Broodtwister, Ovi'nax. This was the 5th boss that we chose to go to, and now we're moving out of the double-digit pull counts into the triple-digit pull counts. So it's crazy that you go from Ulgrax, which was 12 pulls, Bloodbound Horror, which was 10 pulls, Sikran, which was 13 pulls, and then you had Rasha'nan, which was 17 pulls. How many pulls was Broodtwister Ovi'nax? 160 pulls. This boss overall in the heroic version was actually a lot of fun because you can kind of play around with it even early. Breaking the eggs was important, but you only needed one person with the AoE debuff to go stand next to an egg and break it. So you kind of started in the middle of the room, went to the right side of the room, and then went to the left side of the room. And in heroic, the adds weren't empowered like they are in Mythic. So that is the major difference between heroic and Mythic Broodtwister. Not only were the adds not empowered, you didn't have to actually mark specific eggs to break every single time. So you could get away with someone just going off and breaking an egg completely out in the middle of nowhere accidentally, and it was fine. You could recover from that even early on in the season. In Mythic, it was a little more unforgiving. Now, this was one of those bosses in Mythic that became a week aura boss, and it was so frustrating because if someone missed a week of raid, we now had to ensure their weak aura was working correctly. Certain things were turned off in DBM and Little Wigs, and then you would have weird issues where the person's weak aura or DBM or Little Wigs still called out the wrong thing and we were missing egg. This is one of those bosses in Mythic that if in the first area of the room, if you miss an egg, you just wipe. It's not worth even trying to continue. So there was many P1 wipes where you walk in, you miss the first set of eggs, you jump off. The first 50 to 60 pulls were almost like that. It took us a while to see that second phase or second area of the room with the boss. So the majority of these challenges with this boss were weak aura related. However, let's talk about from a tank's point of view, what did I think of this boss? What stood out for me and where would I overall place it? So for me personally, I do like the boss because you actually had to kind of pay attention with the eggs. So early on, you got to learn the routing for the boss. Basically, there are specific spots you need to place the boss. So because you had to make sure the boss was standing in specific spots, that kind of made it interesting for tanks. You couldn't just stand anywhere and then hit the boss. The point of moving the boss around the room was to put him on top of the worms that would spawn. The worms have a cast and they cast continuously, and people are assigned to kick those casts. The faster the worms die, the better. They are priority targets, but having the boss on top of that means raiders can cleave off the worm onto the boss and help the boss die faster. The best thing about this is each phase, as you learn it, required you to stand in a different spot, a different set of eggs, fight slowly backwards. That I really liked. My favorite part of the fight was actually the second area because of the empowered spiders. So that's one thing I mentioned early, is that in each phase, the adds get empowered. In the part of the room that we started on the left, the parasites are the empowered adds. When we move to the middle room, the spiders are the empowered add. And then when we move to the last part of the room, the worms, the casters, are the empowered adds. And because they cast so quickly, that's why we go there last. So it's definitely really fun as a tank to have to learn the movements, learn the positioning, and especially on that second platform. We originally opted for a 3-tank strat. The purpose of the 3-tank strat was that the 2 tanks would handle the boss, the movement, the positioning, and the 3rd tank would actually pick up all of the spiders that spawn. Now, we had 2 blood DKs and also a frost DK, so we had a lot of slappy hands that we could use to help control the parasites and then pick up some of the spiders. And because we were Blood Death Knights, the healing dot that the spiders left wasn't too bad because the raid team knew that they were priority targets. So this is one of those bosses where the adds are always the priority target, and then you cleave off the boss, making it very important for the tank to position the boss where he needs to go. The other thing the tank is worrying about throughout this fight is the volatile concoction. As a Blood Death Knight, you're able to use vampiric blood with an AMS shield, and it also almost mitigates the entire thing, so the raid takes a small hit. However, if you don't have either of those up, or as a Blood DK, if you take one really hard hit and you drop to 70% health, the AoE damage that the raid takes is massive. We caused some wipes because we would take a random hit, stand in a puddle, and take way too much damage. So that was another component of the fight that kept you very engaged as a tank, which I really did enjoy. When we finally got to this boss, we were able to use one of the cheese strats, let's say, where you can actually ignore one of the caster eggs on the last area. So usually you would break 3 of the caster eggs, and then you have 3 sets of people having to kick. Because our damage was so high, we were able to just do 2 of the eggs and then kill the boss off before the black blood reached that worm and empowered it even more. So this is one of those bosses that as a tank, it is highly engaging. There's a lot to pay attention to. Early on, it can feel overwhelming. And then the other part you have to worry about, once you have your portion of the boss down, you know your positioning, you know your kick, you know where you need to go, you know what ads you need to stun, what you're picking up. Once you figure all that out, especially as a Blessed Death Knight, you're sending death grips to pull spiders in so they don't go melee other players. There's a lot to keep a tank busy. The downside to this boss, and it was a big downside, is many wipes due to weak aura problems. Very heavy weak aura boss, which as a tank eventually gets kind of boring when people are dying to the same mechanic because someone's weak aura says orange, but it actually meant star, and suddenly they go to the wrong egg and they don't break it, and it's a wipe. We had this happen in the first phase, second phase, and third phase, and as soon as you miss an egg, you just run off and go again. Overall, I did like the fight. I'm not going to take the points away from it because of the weak auras. Even on heroic, Broodtwister Ovi'nax was a lot of fun to just AoE. The problem, it was always weak auras, was always some silly mistake with missing an egg or not being overlapped enough. But taking away all of that stuff, and just from a tank's point of view, I think they did a great job with Broodtwister. I'm going to put Broodtwister in A because it was a very engaging fight and a lot to pay attention to as a tank. And the 6th boss of the raid, my personal favorite, is Ky'veza. So we chose to go here as our 6th boss after killing Broodtwister, and there isn't really a lot going on in this fight if you think about it mechanically. It's always take Tank Buster, drop portals, dodge balls, position boss to ensure that the dashes go through the boss to drop the boss's stacks, dodge Wolverine blades, drop portal, rinse and repeat. And then of course you have the intermission phase where everyone gets the lines that you have to move around with. And the reason I like this fight is because it's so well paced and so well scripted that when played perfectly, it felt so rewarding. Some of the major changes in Mythic is that the portals, the rift portals you drop, pull a lot harder. So if you do mismanage them, there's a much higher chance for failure because someone's going to get pulled in. The other thing is the Tank Buster really hurts. Blizzard ended up buffing the damage output on the Tank Buster because the World First Raiders soloed the boss with a single tank. Early on, when we got to this boss, you really had to make sure you were mitigating those Void Shredders, otherwise they would shred you. And that is not an over an exaggeration. The amount of damage it did, not only that, the dot they left behind was significant. As a Blood Death Knight, you could heal through most of it when you're the active tank because you're getting those melee hits and you have a way to actually mitigate it. When you're the off tank though, it's a little more concerning. I also did this on my Monk. Monk has a lot more self-sustain in my opinion because it doesn't need to actually take damage to heal itself. You get a free Vivify, you have Expel Harm, you have your orbs that you can pick up that also heal you. So keeping in mind, we came here a lot later on the Monk, so he was a lot more geared, and the initial kill was with the Death Knight. Another change in Mythic is now instead of 3 Wolverine spikes, you get 5 from each clone. And like I mentioned, the dashes need to go through the boss, which have a specific dot that they're leaving on him to drop the boss's stacks. In total, you do 3 on the first phase and then 4 on the second and third phases. Basically, me being the first tank that has to deal with it, I always had to position the boss in a way that on the first set, one of the cloaked ads would go through and drop its stacks on the boss, and then the second and third phases after intermission, it always had to be 2. That also added to the excitement of the boss because all of this happens so fast. Our kill time was just about 6 minutes, which at that point you are enraging. And from start to finish, there is always something going on. As the off tank, you have to ensure that you position the boss well in the middle, because if the boss isn't in the middle, the dashes would actually miss, meaning the cloaked ads would not drop their stacks on the boss, meaning that it would be an instant wipe. If the boss doesn't drop all of her stacks or doesn't get enough of the dashes through it, when the intermission hits, you will instantly wipe. There was a lot of resets on this boss, or portals, missed dashes, tanks just kind of dying, people dying. This was a very heavy DPS check, and just pay attention for 6 minutes, position very well, and you will get this boss done. When this boss is executed perfectly, it feels like art, and that is why I think this is one of the best bosses that they ever made. From the pacing to the mechanics to the enrage timer to the DPS checks to the healing checks, very well done, especially early in the season. This is definitely one of my top bosses that I've ever gotten to participate in. I was excited for this boss in beta, and they came through on live. I think it was fantastic. Our pull count was something around 150. Our logs weren't working correctly, so we don't have an exact number, but I do know it was around 150 attempts before we actually downed it. So we went from Broodtwister, which was 160 pulls, to Ky'veza, which was 150 pulls, up from the Rasha'nan of 17 pulls. But for me, if we take a look at where this boss was positioned later in the raid, the gear was there, we did really well. I am putting this boss in S tier because I absolutely love it, especially from even as a tank, there wasn't a lot you had to do, but you're always on the move, you're always thinking on the fly, because the ads that spawn around the room with the debuffs, you have to see where they are fast enough and then position the boss in the right spot. So this is why I really like this boss. It kept you going the entire 6 minutes. All right, let's keep the hype train going. We're going to jump in and talk about the Silken Court. Now, this is the boss where I officially swapped to my monk since we needed the monk buff, and I was geared enough to handle the boss as a monk tank. The benefits of being on a monk and the changes from heroic to Mythic are very simple. First of all, you have to split the raid up into 2 groups. Each boss gives you a different colored debuff. If you're on Takash's side, you get the blue debuff. If you're on Anubarash's side, you get the red debuff. And every time specific mechanics go out, you drop a orb on the ground that the opposite team needs to soak. With all of that, you also can't run into the opposite team. You instantly die to a mechanic called Betrayal. It just means that you have run into the opposite party, and it's an instant wipe. Takash also continues to cast its poison bolt throughout the entire fight on the active tank that has taunt on it. So as a monk, I actually took Takash full time because I can dispel the poison on myself every 8 seconds. This for me added another level of engagement, which I really appreciated. And the other thing I really liked about this boss is it was very scripted. For a penultimate boss, there is a lot going on. When it comes to the webs, you now need to have 3 sets of webs to actually stop Anubarash from running. You constantly have to deal with the red or the blue orbs, and you have to soak them in every phase of the fight. It doesn't just go away. You get pulled into the boss, and you have to split left and right or straight through. And this was one of those bosses that the entire raid got to participate in every single mechanic, which is different because mostly tanks kind of do their own thing and aren't part of a lot of this. So positioning was critical, especially during the parts of the fight throughout P2 when you get pulled in by Takash. You get paired with someone, you get pulled in, and then you either go left and right or straight through depending on what the Weakora says, and that was really a lot of fun to kind of manage. There's more dispels in Mythic as well, and once again you have a very tight healing and damage check on this fight. We had a few pulls going in where we would enrage the boss and almost get the kill. This was the first boss where we went north of 200 pulls. It actually took us 258 pulls to get our first kill on it, and each phase was a lot of fun. Phase 1 is very simple, just kind of walk around the boss, pick up the orbs, move to the next boss, do damage, wait till you phase it. After that, you go into phase 2. This is the phase where Takash now regularly pulls you in, and every time she pulls you in, you have to make sure you don't run into the other team and still pick up all of the orbs. As the tank, you move Anubarash back and forth. You actually don't want to stack Anubarash on top of Takash, especially during the dispels. You wait till the dispels go out, and then you move Anubarash on top. There's baiting that needs to occur of the frontals from Anubarash and Takash. You actually don't want to point them at the raid team, especially during the damage amps. You need those damage amps to be able to down the boss. And then the second intermission is the same as heroic. Both intermissions are actually the same as the heroic version of the fight, but again, the difference is you're now walking around the boss picking up the red or blue orbs depending on which debuff you have, and making sure you don't run into the other team. So you can't go too fast and you can't go too slow. Going too fast, you run into the other team. Going too slow, they run into you. So it's definitely a lot of fun even during intermission. That added level of difficulty, having the debuffs that you have to soak, was a good addition to the fight. Again, the biggest thing I liked about this fight is it was scripted. You could push the boss faster to skip a set of mechanics, but you always had to do them. So early on in the raid, you had to do all of the mechanics as it read through. The most challenging thing and the most frustrating thing was that in P3, everything happens so quickly. You would go from getting the swarm to getting the AoE circles on the ground and getting the charge to getting pulled in, then getting the charge, and then still having to soak everything, not break your webs. We had a few wipes where unfortunately someone would run into someone with betrayal later on, and then we couldn't actually stop a Nerub'ar from hitting the wall, so the charges would go through. Once we figured that out and had it working smoothly, it felt really good getting this boss down. I would say that for a second last boss, having something that's a little more scripted, having a good damage check on it and a high healing check on it was exactly what we needed. The taunt swap for tanks was very simple. The things that I liked about this from a tank perspective is that we got to participate. We could go in and soak the orbs as well. If needed, we could hang on to our webs and actually help stop a Nerub'ar from charging. As a monk, I constantly got to dispel myself, and then you also have to position to make sure you can bring the boss in for the damage amps. So very well paced boss, very engaging boss. I think Blizzard did a great job with this one as well. So taking a look at where I would rank this boss, I definitely do feel like this is another A-tier boss. It was a well done, well scripted fight. Not a lot to do from a tank perspective, but it was still a lot of fun as a tank to be a part of all of the different mechanics. And now, ladies and gentlemen, I bring you the last boss of the raid, Queen Ansurek. I did this boss. This was the first tier ever that I managed to get a cutting edge achievement, so I can officially say I've tried the bosses on Heroic and on Mythics. Taking a look at it in Mythic, there are some significant changes. For example, the pops that you have to do of the poison need to be staggered, otherwise they will wipe the raid. There are now 3 pops instead of just the 2. The tank busters are much more significant. I was the tank taking Liquefy, and if I missed a defensive, there were times Liquefy would take me from 100 down to 10% health. Most of the time you would live, but it was a scary moment where you instantly had to pop a health pot or a health stone and hope that your healers were paying attention. Some of the things that really change on Mythic is your positioning is very, very important in P1. P1 being the most challenging part of the fight because, again, like we mentioned, there's now 3 poison pops that you have to deal with. The same person can't pop the poison each time. It has to be someone different. So you have to assign 9 people in the raid to deal with the pops, as there's 3 sets of pops, and that means 3 pops to do, so 3 people for each phase. And then on top of that, as Queen Ansurek moves around the room, when you pop the poison, it also leaves the AoE on the ground, and then also when you do the web roots, they leave an AoE on the ground. So you want to ensure throughout Mythic that you don't run out of space during the intermission phase. The other addition to this fight is during the intermission phase, the pull is much stronger, and every time you get pulled in, you leave a web puddle on the ground, and these puddles just continue to grow through the entire boss fight. Early on when we got here, we were actually running out of room as melee. As a tank, what I would do is actually roll into the bad and use Transcendence on the second pull and just a roll on the first and third if we had it, so that way I can leave my web puddle in the poison or on top of a previous web puddle. They didn't do a lot of damage as a tank, so that was kind of nice. Once you got through the intermission, you then have to deal with the portals and ad phases. We had so many wipes with the portals. The change here is that a portal spawns on each side of the room. If a player doesn't go through it fast enough, the portal explodes, wiping the raid. So we had players assigned that had to go through the portals to ensure that they didn't explode in a certain amount of time. This took a lot of practice. It wasn't a challenging mechanic, but it did take players time to get used to it. As a tank, you're just on the platform killing the ads. You get pulled, you bring the ad over, you basically kill it, and you dodge and get hit by stuff. As the pull happens, you roll out and you carry on. The second platform is the one where they now spawn 2 acolyte ads that need to be interrupted. This is different from Heroic. In Heroic, you didn't have to deal with these ads. In Mythic, you do. So these ads have a kick rotation. Early on, they actually assigned me as the monk a kick for one of the acolytes. We found out very quickly that I can't reach it as a melee. These ads can only be kicked by someone who has a ranged kick, so range class. So it was definitely a neat addition to the platforms to make them a little more engaging. And then as you get to the third platform, same thing again. You have to deal with the ads you dealt with on the first one, and then a couple of the skitters, and you got bopped up. The second phase during the platforms is actually the easiest part of the fight once you learn how to deal with the portals. That was the most challenging thing to get the hang of. Once we then saw the third platform and Queen Ansurek landed, it was shortly after that that we were able to kill the boss. We did have some tank wipes. So the difference here is that on Mythic, you have to taunt Infest during the cast again. So think Rasha'nan when you were taunting mid Savage Assault. Same thing here. If you miss that taunt, if it hits after the 50% mark, it will go on the active tank, meaning the ads will spawn directly under Queen Ansurek and cause a wipe. We experienced that as well. In that phase as well, the Infest and the Gorge hit extremely hard. As a monk, I had to use the defensive on every single one, which ensured that you're really paying attention to what's happening. P3 seems extremely chaotic, but it's not as hectic as you think once you get there. It looks worse than it is. For the portals, as a monk, I had the advantage of I didn't have to take the portal and get the AoE debuff. I could just transcendence through. So using my tank utility made a big difference on the fight. Now, the pull was still very strong, where I almost died a couple times not realizing it early on. But once I understood that there's going to be a strong pull just to make sure I move away from Queen Ansurek and then I would survive, it was very easy to handle. And really, that is it for P3. Right after you land, you get the Infest, you do the taunt, you get the portals, you get the big ads, and then she lands, and it's rinse and repeat. As a tank, if you really think about it, the biggest challenge of Queen Ansurek is do not miss a defensive. Make sure you have something up for the liquefies in P1, and make sure you have something up for the Gorge cast in P3. They will kill you if you don't, especially Gorge. There was a couple times I almost died because I forgot to press the defensive and hit it on the second or third hit. Our first kill of this boss was absolutely fantastic. You guys got to check it out. And my reaction was priceless. I thought it was over and we weren't actually going to kill the boss because we ended up wiping sub 0.001%. However, we got lucky. Our Death Knight purgatoried, our priest was an angel, and we had a chamois onk to ensure we can get across the finish line. And we ended up getting the Mythic CE Queen Ansurek kill. So check out that video. But for me, this fight, the biggest challenge was getting used to the positioning, learning to dodge all the mechanics, and then just making sure you always have a defensive buff for her really big hits. If we jump into where I would place this boss on the tier list, I thought it was a great boss. However, if you think about like the positioning and all that, our off tank did the positioning and he basically went to the same spot every single time in P1. So the debuffs would come out, he would move to the same corner. Debuffs would come out, he would move to the same corner. Yes, you have to dodge, but like you don't really have to think about where you're positioning the boss, just move her to the same spot. P2, there is no positioning, just really move the ads on top of each other so the DPS can nuke them down. And then P3, the biggest thing is just go around in a circle, keep the boss near some ads. So the movement wasn't like insane, and the biggest challenge was keeping your defensives up. This boss took us 244 pulls, but even with that, I do think it was a very good fight. I'm kind of torn between throwing it in S tier because yes, it was good and it was a last boss. Like once I got the hang of the boss, once I understood what defensive I had to use, I was on autopilot for most of the pulls. So I'm really torn between S or A. If there was like something between S and A, that's probably where I would put Queen Ansurek. Like it's like an A plus or an S minus, you know what I mean? But we'll throw Queen Ansurek in S tier just because overall it was a good fight. So some notes I want to point out about this raid. The thing that I really do appreciate that Blizzard has done, none of the bosses were over 10 minutes long. And I understand that we came in this a little later, so the timings may be a bit different and skewed because we started getting the refinery buff and things got a little easier. But I do think even with that, like looking back at some of the early kills, even if the boss was over 10 minutes, it wasn't much over. And I really do appreciate that. For example, Silken Court enrages at the 9-minute mark, so you have to kill it before that. And I think as a raider, that was a welcome change from bosses like Sylvanas, bosses like Farak, that just were an overload of mechanics with an overload of how long you have to stay active on these fights. So I will give Blizzard credit there, and I am personally looking forward to the Undermine. I think if Blizzard continues this trend, the bosses are going to be just as fun and just as engaging. So for the last time, here is our tier list. We have 3 bosses in S, 3 bosses in A, 1 boss in B tier, and a boss in D tier. Let me know down in the comments what you thought of the raid and what was your favorite boss. What would you, if you could go back and just do one boss on a repeat, what would it be in Nerub'ar Palace? Let me know down in the descriptions below. As always, thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Have a fantastic week, you guys. I'll catch you on the next one. Peace out.